These rocks are often much older, but Africa as we know it is really only 150 million years old. Before it was merely part of a giant continent, Gondwana. When Gondwana broke up, South America separated from Africa, and that's when the story of Africa really started. Ever since, it's been a tale of deserts, lakes, relief, and landscapes. In the northwest of Africa, in Senegal, a few hundred yards from the shore, a cordon of dunes forms a barrier between the Atlantic Ocean and a small lake, Lake Retba. Lake Retba is gradually disappearing. Even its name is changing. Most people nowadays call it the Pink Lake. For some years now, in the middle of the day, the lake has been taking on some startling colours. The higher the sun in the sky, the more intense the colour of the lake. Actually, the water is not really coloured. It's an illusion created by the sun reflecting off microorganisms. The algae and bacteria that cause the illusion thrive in extremely salty water. Lake Retba is an old pocket of seawater which is now cut off from the ocean. Rainwater is its only source of fresh water, and there's not enough of that to dilute the masses of salt in suspension. The water is completely saturated with almost a pound of salt per litre, 10 times as much as in seawater. Men have put this quirk of nature to good use. Lake Retba is used as an entirely natural salt factory. The methods used are simple and the tools rudimentary. What could be more natural? The women gather the salt which the men scrape off the lake bottom. The water is so corrosive that before taking the plunge, they cover their bodies with shea butter. As the day draws on, the piles grow higher, but each worker easily recognizes his harvest. One day, the mounds of salt will disappear from the shores of the Pink Lake. The water in the middle of the lake is only 5 feet deep, and underneath it lies a crust of salt just as thick. Nobody knows when the supply will run out. Salt is a mysterious substance, ordinary but at the same time precious, white and yet red, taking on strange forms where you least expect it, to illustrate the story of Africa. In the Ma language of the Maasai, the word for salt is magadi. That's the name they gave to this strange basin in the south of Kenya. 15 miles long and a few miles wide, Lake Magadi is no ordinary lake. It's a sort of magic bowl that transforms water at an amazing rate, never leaving it long in the liquid state. The region is one of the hottest in Kenya. The lake would have dried up a long time ago if it had to rely on rainwater alone. but the water that evaporates is replaced by a very special kind of water. It comes from the bottom of the lake, where hot springs bubble, saturated with mineral salts. The patterns that form on the surface are reproductions of the cracks and crevices through which the water leaks up from the bedrock. The deposits accumulate at a phenomenal speed. This white crust encloses an amazing treasure: salt, sodium, potassium in what appear to be unlimited quantities. Estimated at about 200 million tons, it's one of the largest deposits in the world. It's been exploited industrially and intensively since the beginning of the century, and it doesn't seem to be shrinking, on the contrary. The deposits accumulate faster than they're extracted. In 1962, the water in the lake was neither blue nor red, but a sinister pale color. On its surface floated the dead bodies of tens of thousands of birds. The rainfall in the region had been unusually heavy, and the flamingos had not been able to nest in their usual place on Lake Natron in Tanzania. By nesting here in nearby Magadi, they sealed the fate of their young. No sooner did the chicks hatch than they got caught in the viscous water and were unable to escape from the sticky sodium deposits. The flamingos still come back to Magadi, but they never nest there. Saltwater lakes attract them irresistibly. They thrive on the algae they find there. This part of Africa is their favorite region. There are several saltwater lakes on a strip of land 250 miles long from north to south, enough to feed hundreds of thousands of flamingos. This colony is the largest in the world. It spreads over 2 lakes, Nakuru and Bogoria, flying back and forth from one to the other for no apparent reason. But what's a mystery to man is logical to the birds. Their choice is the fruit of a complex equation with a number of variables: season, evaporation, rainfall. What it boils down to is the level of the lake and the salinity of the water. When the balance is just right, the algae and microorganisms multiply. This time, it's at Bogoria that the flamingos have found food galore. At a rough estimate, there are about 500,000 birds in the colony. Lake Bogoria is like Lake Magadi, salty and shallow, and it's also dotted with hot springs. But here they bubble up into the open air on the western shore of the lake. This site was discovered in 1885 by James Hannington, a missionary on his way to his new post in Uganda. Imagine the surprise and disappointment of his expedition. They thought they would find fresh water on the shores of the lake to quench their thirst. Few geysers throw out water at a modest height. They look harmless enough, but appearances can be deceptive. Around the geysers, the ground is extremely thin, and it regularly caves in under the weight of careless sightseers who boil to death. With these springs of boiling water, the Earth reminds us of where we are, right on top of a major fault line, the Great Rift. Lake Bogoria formed when the runoff water was imprisoned by these cliffs. The cliffs were suddenly thrust up 40 million years ago when the Earth's crust split. A gaping hole almost 4,000 miles long from north to south opened in the African continent, from the shores of the Red Sea to Mozambique, causing a colossal subsidence, a succession of parallel faults and escarpments. The Rift Valley is the most spectacular and most directly visible part of this geological phenomenon, which is unique in its magnitude. The movements of the Earth's crust were accompanied here by a long period of extraordinary volcanic activity. In 30 million years, in Ethiopia and Kenya, several 100,000 cubic miles of lava and ash spilled out into the valley, enough to cover England under a coat 2 miles deep. All over the region, the landscape was shaped by this volcanic activity. In places, erosion has left its mark. In others, the volcanic landscapes remained untouched. Some landmarks make no secret of their origin. Mount Longonot, which rises to 9,000 feet, is a model volcano. Longonot comes from a Maasai word that means rugged mountain. Longonot is a dormant volcano. This part of Africa is dotted with a multitude of volcanic cones of different shapes and sizes in various states of dormancy. There are 250 like these on the flanks of an enormous volcano, enormous and yet discreet. It has a very special claim to fame. It's the roof of the continent, the highest summit in Africa, Kilimanjaro. The snow-capped mountain is in fact a majestic old volcano over 17,000 feet high. The nearer you get to the summit, the more barren the landscape becomes, and the more Kilimanjaro reveals its volcanic nature, until its flanks are nothing but a desert of lava flows. Kilimanjaro began to rise 750,000 years ago. It took tens of thousands of years to reach its present height. The lava spewed out of 3 main craters, Shira, Kibo, and Mawenzi. Mawenzi no longer looks like a volcano, and yet these needles of rock are the eroded remains of its crater. Kibo was the last to become extinct 450,000 years ago. Its crater had amassed lava to a height of almost 4 miles. In Tanzania, 200 miles away as the crow flies, Kilimanjaro once had a twin brother a long time ago. Another very similar huge volcano, but its cone was blown right off when it exploded 2.5 million years ago. Only the truncated walls of its slopes remain and the plugged bottom of the old extinct crater. Now they call it the Big Hole, Ngorongoro in the Maasai language. The German explorer Oscar Baumann discovered the site in 1892. From the lip of the crater, he gave this enthusiastic description. The walls are 2,000 feet high. It's 12 miles from one end to the other. Baumann had discovered one of the largest calderas in the world, but it was not until he went down to the bottom of the crater that he discovered the true measure of this marvel of nature. It's a sort of Noah's Ark, intact, a remnant of a bygone era. The animals are incredibly trusting, and there are so many of them. Almost every species is represented. At the beginning of the 20th century, the crater was to become a favorite venue for wealthy hunters. One of them boasted of killing 12 rhinos in the space of 3 days. Eventually, the site was protected before it was too late. The density of animals is still exceptional in this formidable natural amphitheater, large enough to hold 3 cities the size of Paris. There are 350 species of birds, several thousand herbivores, and a few hundred predators. There are over 150 large mammals to the square mile. If there are so many animals here, it's because the natural conditions are exceptionally favorable. They all have plenty to eat and drink all year round. Over the last few centuries, the animals have shared the watering holes with the Maasai herds. They have nothing to fear from these nomadic herdsmen who only hunt when they absolutely have to. When stringent protection measures were imposed in the crater, the Maasai were allowed to continue to bring their herds there to water. It's one of the only places for miles around where there's water even in the dry season. The flanks of the crater form a natural wall which influences the local climate. Most of the time, the summit sits in a ring of clouds, which mysteriously stop halfway down. The clouds provide enough humidity to hydrate a small tropical forest on the edge of the slope. This forest plays a fundamental role in the whole ecosystem. It's rather like a great sponge, absorbing water in the rainy season and relinquishing it little by little as the dry season advances. At the foot of the south slope of the crater, the earth of the old volcano gives out so much water that a small lake has formed there. In a small area, the crater encloses an astonishing variety of environments. There's something for every animal in this miniature replica of Africa. It's like a theatre, a succession of tableaus in a single place, in which the dramas and comedies of life are played out every day. This little piece of forest where monkeys and elephants live has a story to tell. Two German families settled here at the beginning of the 20th century. They tried to tame zebras and rear ostriches. They also grew tobacco. Nobody knows how they managed to keep the thousands of canoes from trampling their crops underfoot. There are about 15,000 canoes today. Their number has doubled in a few years. The animals come and go. In spite of the steep walls that surround it, most animals manage to find their way in and out of the crater. The lions see no reason to look further afield and are content to stay where they are, exposing themselves to the risk of inbreeding and to their worst enemy, the fly. In the 60s, they were attacked by millions of flies, which bit them so many times that they literally emptied them of their blood. 4 out of 5 lions succumbed to the tiny killers. Only the giraffes are excluded from the magic crater. They stay around the edges of the giant hole, never venturing into it. It would no doubt be difficult for them to do so, but that's not the reason. There are hardly any acacia trees in the crater, and acacias are their staple diet. Only a few miles away there are countless better places for them. The shores of Lake Manyara, or the Serengeti Plain, which the Ngorongoro fertilized with its ashes when it exploded all those years ago. All is peaceful today in this part of Africa, and yet the continent is still breaking up. The phenomenon is most spectacular further north in the Great Afar Depression. The Afar Depression is a vast basin in the northeast of Ethiopia between Eritrea and Somalia. Here we're at the exact junction of three fractures in the Earth's crust, three rifts: the Great African Rift, the Red Sea, and the Gulf of Aden. They form an angle of 120 degrees with one another, and they're still opening slowly. Under the waters of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, the fault grows about an inch wider every year. In this part of the world, the Earth's crust is under extraordinary pressure at all times. At the heart of the depression, there's a place where everything seems even more fragile, more vulnerable than elsewhere, in the Assal Rift in Djibouti. Here, the Earth trembles every day. The Earth's crust is extremely thin and fragile. Even on the surface, it cannot withstand the great upheavals going on underneath. These cracks are the surface signs of disturbing things going on in the depths of the Earth. They're warnings of the major cataclysm that will one day hit the Assal Rift. The rift occupies a strip of land of 40 square miles between Lake Assal and the Gulf of Tujura. The region is used to spectacular events. One day, 2 explosions in the sea threw up 2 new islands, the Devil's Islands. As the lava spewed out of the underwater fissures, it was literally vitrified on contact with the water. This apocalyptic landscape is an open book of volcanology. Against this background of hardened magma and dark lava flows, the luminous waters of Lake Assal stand out, a truly extraordinary lake. Barely 6,000 years ago, Lake Assal covered an area of 450 square miles, 20 times larger than its present area. The walls overlooking the lake bear the traces of the fall in the water level. It happened extremely fast, in the space of 500 years. The lake has become a genuine natural curiosity. Its level is now below sea level. It's the lowest point on the African continent, on average 500 feet below sea level. "5,500 years ago, the lake deposited a wide belt of gypsum all around its shores, a sedimentary substance used among other things to make plaster. Gypsum is a soft rock. Here its usually shiny crystals are dulled by age and dust. Crystals of the same type are in the process of forming in the shallow water around the edge of the lake. The deposits form because the water is oversaturated with calcium salt. The accumulation of gypsum forms small outcrops which are covered in turn with white deposits. Lake Assal is one of the hottest places in the world. The extremely high temperature accelerates the evaporation of the lake water, which is also saturated with sodium salt. The salt is deposited in the form of crystals of halite or rock salt, in other words, common salt. The crystals generally take the form of little white cubes, but in Djibouti they're often perfectly spherical. There are vast amounts of it in the northeast end of the lake, where it forms a veritable salt flow. In places the layer of salt is 200 feet thick. The extreme salinity of Lake Assal is an indication of what might one day happen to the African continent. The salt comes straight from the sea. The sea supplies Lake Assal with water through a multitude of small fissures, cracks in the Earth's crust. In 2 million years, the sea will have the last say. It will spill into the lake and flood all these lava flats which still separate the Gulf of Aden from Lake Assal. Much later still, the crack will open further, and a new continent will break off. The East African continent. All this will happen in 20 million years' time. 2 million years, 20 million years, notions difficult for us humans to grasp. But there are clues to this infernal timescale all over the continent. These are on the southern tip of Africa. These rocks we see here today look almost exactly like they did 450 million years ago. They're in South Africa on the Cape Peninsula. The excavation work along the cliff at Chapman's Peak to build the road exposed this amazing geological section. It clearly shows how the successive sedimentary strata were deposited. And the most surprising thing is how they're all perfectly horizontal. Nothing has disturbed their slumber since the primary era. The whole peninsula dates from that ancient era. Only the sea has imperceptibly altered the details of this long ridge, stretching 30 miles to the south. The end of the peninsula is Cape Point, often mistakenly considered to be the southernmost tip of Africa, which is in fact further round the coast at Needle Cape. But for generations of sailors, the symbol of the passage from one ocean to another was here, just nearby, in the Cape of Good Hope. A few hours before passing the Cape of Good Hope, the sailors knew they were reaching the tip of Africa. When they saw the shape of this mountain rise up on the port side, a mountain so flat that they called it Table Mountain. Table Mountain is in fact the imposing face of the rocky ridge that runs right through the peninsula. Here its summit was literally swept clean of the softest, most brittle rocks during the ice ages of the Quaternary era. The result is this horizontal tableland, 4,000 feet above sea level. The top of the plateau is often shrouded in clouds. According to popular legend, it's the smoke from a pipe smoking contest between an old Afrikaner settler and the devil. More prosaically, the explanation is a meteorological phenomenon caused by a southeasterly wind. It's known locally as the Cape Doctor because of the therapeutic virtues it's said to have. This imposing sight has certainly fired people's imagination. Every rock which is in the least spectacular has a name. To the left of Table Mountain lies the Devil's Peak, and to the right the Lion's Head. It takes a lot of imagination, with a favorable light and a fair amount of goodwill, to see a lion's head in these rock formations. On the west side of the cliff, the imagery is easier to grasp. They just counted the rocky promontories and called them the 12 Apostles. The slopes of Table Mountain are a huge garden where more flowers grow than in any other part of the world. 22,000 plant species have been counted in South Africa, but this small area around Table Mountain alone boasts 1,400 types of flower. All these colourful splendours vying for the attention of the world's botanists have a rather unlikely rival a few hundred miles away in neighbouring Namibia. This is a male flower, but the female is no more graceful. It's wilted and seems forever at death's door, but that's its nature. The Afrikaners who studied it carefully called it two leaves that cannot die. And sure enough, this specimen is 1,500 years old, one of the oldest plants in the world. But some go back even further, to the birth of the Christian era. It was an Austrian botanist who first took an interest in this curious plant. That was in 1859. He gave it his name. The welwitschia lives only in these arid, stony plains. For a long time, people wondered how it managed to survive in such a hostile climate. At first they thought the plant must have a giant root 100 yards long that drew water from the water table far below. In actual fact, its roots are only 3 yards long. It gets most of the water it needs for its survival from the pores in its leaves, which absorb every last droplet of condensation. In spite of its unruly appearance, the welwitschia only has 2 leaves. Their ends split and break up over the years because of the heat. Otherwise, they'd grow to lengths of several hundred yards. In a region where the vegetation is so sparse, it may seem surprising that the welwitschia are not immediately gobbled up by some animal. But they have a built-in defense. They taste disgusting. The welwitschia is a surprising plant in every respect. Although it has features in common with flowers and mosses, it in fact belongs to the conifer family. Trees don't exactly abound in the region, but there are some very unusual specimens in the northwest of the country, in the region of Corixas. They lie flat on the ground, broken up or half buried. Some are up to 100 feet long, with a 20-foot girth. Although the trunks are 260 million years old, the bark and the texture of the wood remain intact. The trees have turned to stone. The silicate gradually impregnated the wood fibers, and the trees bade farewell to the vegetable kingdom. Strange as it may seem, no traces of branches or roots were found. It must have been driftwood washed up here by a flood, or by the sea when it partially covered this region of Damara land. For a really clear measure of the age of these trees, we need to go just next door to the petrified forest, near Twyfell Fountain, where 100 million years later, geological upheavals carved out yet another natural wonder, a wall of organ pipes. Organ pipes is the name geologists give to these formations of 6-sided columns of rock. This particular example is exceptional. Its forms are perfect, and the 15-foot columns compose a sumptuous natural sculpture 100 yards long. These prisms were created by the brutal cooling of the lava at the time of the volcanic eruptions that occurred in the region 150 million years ago, during the Jurassic period, when craters formed all over Africa, covering parts of the continent with a thick coat of basalt. You can see outcrops of this basalt in Zimbabwe along the Zambezi River. The slope is gentle here and the water flows slowly, peacefully marking the boundary between Zambia on the left bank and Zimbabwe on the right bank. The great river slowly erodes the rock here, unaware that further downstream the basalt plain suddenly opens up, leaving the river to hurtle down to its new bed 300 feet lower. The only clues are a column of smoke and a roaring noise that grows louder and louder the closer you get. Then the Zambezi suddenly plunges, creating one of the most spectacular sights to be seen anywhere in the world: the Victoria Falls. Every minute, several 100 million litres of water fall into the abyss. At their highest point, the falls are 350 feet high, but the most amazing thing is the configuration of the falls. Over a ridge more than a mile wide, the river plunges into a narrow corridor far below. The Victoria Falls are the widest in the world. The spectacle is best seen from the air. The vast river flowing across the basalt plain suddenly throws itself into a gorge perpendicular to its course. The Makololo tribes who lived upstream from the falls called them Mosi Oatunya, which in their dialect meant the rising smoke. The droplets thrown up by the falls are caught in a rising current of air that carries them to a height of 1,600 feet. As they fall again, they create a sort of drizzle that bathes the immediate environs of the falls all year round, generating a microclimate with luxuriant vegetation. Over a few hundred square yards, a veritable miniature jungle has developed, of a kind seen nowhere else in this otherwise arid region. It's not difficult to imagine the awe-inspiring effect of this spectacle on the local tribes who've lived in the area for hundreds of thousands of years. This vision of nature unchained filled them with fear and respect. In its spectacular flight, the liquid element became a god. And to pacify the angry divinity, they would sacrifice unfortunate victims by throwing them over the cliff. The falls were also called Shongwe, then Amanza Tonkayo, before they were named after the Queen of England. The explorer David Livingstone discovered these falls in 1855 on a November day just like this. It was low water season. The river was almost at its lowest level. But even in the dry season, when the waters of the Zambezi boil and churn at the foot of the falls, their mighty power of erosion never fails to impress. As if in a hurry to reach the sea, the Zambezi hurtles through these gorges for many miles, digging into the basalt, gouging out the softest parts of the rock.